Traveston Crossing Dam is a very emotional topic for a lot of people.
It made my mother cry.
I can remember the first day it was announced.
The day it happened, we heard the announcement. The first thing we heard was on the radio.
I can remember the day it was announced.
I can remember it very vividly.
I was just so upset that they were going to ruin our valley.
You have not consulted the Indigenous peoples of the land.
Well, anybody that lived here knew it wasn't going to work.
It made my mother cry. I don't think it would have affected us where we are, but I don't know how. I don't think they'd planned on how anybody could get out or into Imbil. So it might have. It was awful.
Just really missed the people that left once the dam was announced. A lot of people panicked and sold, and so the town was never the same again, and it still isn't today the same. Even though people have bought in homes again, they're not involved like the people that were there previously. Yeah, so that was a really sad thing. The school's gone back, like there was a lot of children going to school, but not many these days. I can remember the first day it was announced, and we couldn't believe it. To start with, we thought, this is not true. And then it set in that it was a real thing, and that's when people started to panic. And I was very involved in the information centre then, and that became the hub of the town, and people came there to let out their grievances for the damage the dam had on the town.
The day it happened, we heard the announcement. The first thing we heard was on the radio, and then the news that night, it was just everywhere with them standing out there and saying, this is where we're going to build the dam to save Brisbane. That was the main thing. I think the only thing he was trying to save was his own political hide. But anyway, that's another story. But yeah, and the community, as soon as the announcement was made, the community just got up in arms. They got cranky, and then they realised where it was going. And then people with a little bit of now saying, well, you know, once you come out of the riverbanks, there's nothing, it's just flat. So how much water are you going to save or store? And then it started coming out, about 3 metres, and then everyone got on the bandwagon and said it's not viable, and then the fight started, and that's where it went. We had a business, we had a livestock transport business. It took about 58% of our business away from us overnight, and that lasted for years. We were just lucky that, you know, we had other things, and we did have a few beef cattle and that we could keep plodding on. But it was only after the announcement was made by Peter Garrett that it wasn't going to go ahead that you could see it turn around a bit then. And our business, I wouldn't say overnight, but within 6 to 9 months, it started to show signs of recovery. And in the last 3 or 4 years, it's been a very good business again.
I was on the what should we say, the opposing side. I didn't want the dam. It wasn't, I mean, the logical thing was, look at the land, look at where you want to put this dam, it's not going to be deep enough. And everyone could see that. I was really upset about how all those long-term people who had been in that country for generations had been taken off their land and not even given enough to get a decent home somewhere else. And then the land was sold off to other people. They weren't even offered it back. That was really disgusting, I thought. That shows me that the government has no real consideration for anyone, especially the history, the people who made the history, the people who made this town, who made everything around this town for other people to be able to be here today. I don't know how many people think about that these days. It did, and as everything else, I see Gympie seems to be like the little hole tucked away, and then all of a sudden someone in government or business or whatever will go, oh, we can get that for that, and we'll use that. But they don't consult the people. It's the same as the water drilling down at Traveston, down that way, the Traveston, the township, how that person was allowed to drill and siphon out all of that water, and that made the rest of the township suffer. You know, what he didn't really get any repercussion on that. And all I see is that it's run through governments who have no ideals of real life people and real life townships. We're always overlooked in Gympie for all the government agencies, majority of them. I work out of, I'd love to work in Gympie, but I work out of Gympie because the agencies are outside of Gympie. So that's where I have to work. And these are all the points that I had put forward. There is no research done. You have not consulted the Indigenous peoples of the land. There is sacred areas here that you need to take into consideration. The argument I put forth with that was, oh, so you've got a heritage building there that you cannot alter or change in any form because it is heritage. Just because this is a plot of land, it has heritage. It has significant heritage. And like there are areas there where there were significant camping areas for Indigenous peoples. So they didn't even look at that. And this is the trouble with big business and government today. They look at the money situation and what they can reap out of that, and they say that it's, oh, well, we're going to employ more people. Nothing came out of it. Even with the main roads that are going through with the new highway, how many people working on that are actually people from this area? You know, they could support this area by employing more people, and there are people who have the engineering degrees, there are people who have roadwork degrees or whatever they need to work in that area. I know of maybe just a small handful of people who are working on areas in that highway. But as far as I'm concerned, they need to employ, as they go along, the people of the township they're going through. Yeah. Help them out a bit. You're destroying their country. That was our dairy hub. Gympie supplied Queensland with a dairy. You know, that was, and our pineapples and all that other stuff. But all those dairy pastures were considered able to be drowned. And all that would have been like, I actually stayed out at Emmamore last year. My daughter came up from Thredbo, so we hired a house, you know, those B&Bs, and it belonged to not Tremakis, Holzapples. And we got talking about the land and that, and the house was up on a hill, but if the dam had gone through, all of that down below them where they had their dairy cattle would have been flooded, and they would have had no land. They would have lost hundreds and hundreds of acres, if not thousands of acres. And that's just one family. So I don't know how many families were displaced. Well, they'd already taken their land. I mean, could you imagine, you've spent your life on farming property, farming, and then the government comes along and says, oh, we want that land and we're only going to give you pittance for it. And you're put in a small home on a small block of land. Could you imagine the stress, the adjustment that that those people would have had to make. They should have never taken the land off those people until they had done all their research and sorted all that out. They should never have bought up that land. They did, and that was wrong, and that was Anna Bligh. I do not care for that person, and I don't care for Mr. Campbell Newman, who's closed all schools in Queensland. And, you know, like things like that, that affects country towns immensely. It's not fair on, they don't, what should I say, they don't consider the impact of their ideals. They're sitting in an office in a city. They've probably never been in a countryside, never had to know the workings of living in a countryside. And they're going, oh yeah, we're looking at figures and facts and this will work and that'll work, but you're dealing with human content. So that alone is something that needs to be addressed with governments.
Living in Brisbane at the Traveston Dam, very vocally up against it down in, well, anybody that lived here knew it wasn't going to work. And that was it. I look back, or even at the time too, and I thought it was more or less a punishment thing. The government at the time didn't like the fact that we were very pro the other side. And if they could get their fingernails into us, well, they would. So one of the boys I went to school with, and I introduced him to my cousin, and they married, they fell in love, and that was the end of everything. He committed suicide over it. Yeah. So yes, it did severely affect the area. He had been involved in a on-farm tractor accident, and because of the accident he didn't have full mobility, and they couldn't sell their farm because of the dam supposedly going in. And the funny thing is, you know, just recently there's something about the lungfish. There's some sort of connection to a cure for Alzheimer's. When I was a teenager, we had a turtle come up out of the creek and lay her eggs in our garden. I never ever saw any hatch out, so I don't think there was. But I found a little penny, what they call a penny turtle, in the middle of the road one day, and I tried to keep it, but he got out, and he made his way down to the creek. And I rescued one out on the Link Road, just before the first, before you come onto the first roundabout. It had been clipped by the car in front of me, and when I picked it up, it was only not a full-grown one, but you know, big enough, and he had a crack in his shell, he or her had a crack in his shell underneath, so I brought him into Shannon Street. They got sick and tired of me in the end because I was bringing birds in. But yeah, as far as I know, he survived, and they took all the details of where I found him, and yeah. It was
Stopping the Traveston Dam, I was on council when the dam was stopped, and I remember Gary and I went on a holiday. We were out at Uluru. We were on our way to Uluru. We stopped over at Alice Springs. And when I got there, there was a flurry going on that Peter Garrett was staying at that resort. And I had to meet him because I wanted him to stop this dam. And so I did get to meet him in a flurry in one of the corridors. And he said, I'll be back here tonight at 9. I'll talk to you then. Gary and I waited and waited and waited. He didn't turn up. I ended up with a migraine. Went back to the room. I got out the little notepad that's in the room, and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. And I just wrote for like 3 hours, put all my feelings, all my frustrations onto paper. And Gary kept saying, would you just stop it and get to bed? You're not feeling well. I can't, I have to do this. So I got all my feelings out. I put it in an envelope, wrote on it very professionally, like, walked down to the foyer the next morning to the desk. And I just walked up and said, "Oh, good morning. Mr. Garrett's just waiting for this. Could you hand this to him, please?" And we walked off and Gary said, "How did you do that?" I said, "Well, you know," I don't know to this day whether he got that letter. I sincerely hope that he did, because being such a long-term Mary Valley resident, being on council, being family, I was just so upset that they were going to ruin our valley, when years before we had taken the government up to Lake Barumba, stood on the wall of Lake Barumba and said, "This is the place, the ideal place for a dam extension." They own all the land. They own the whole lot. People that are there are leasing it back. They could just extend the wall 25 metres, lovely. But no, somebody had a rush of blood. Might have wanted to call it the whatever dam or lake whatever. But anyhow, it was exciting. It was knocked on the head in the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And it was so much a thrill to have that knocked on the head. And we got a nice big road from the valley to the highway in place of it. I think that was a payback, but we don't know. I don't know for sure. Something happened there. But, and we also got a nice big service centre out there, being the Traveston Service Centre. So a lot of jobs for the Mary Valley, I hope.
The proposed Traveston Crossing Dam. I can remember the day it was announced. I was sitting in a seminar out at the Forestry Training Centre at Gympie, and I was with the council, the mayor and the councillors, and my first thoughts were, is this right? Because being an engineer, I had certain thoughts about where you'd obviously put a dam and where you'd obviously not put a dam. So right from the word go, I was involved. I was council's engineer at the time. I subsequently became effectively the secretary or executive officer for the Council of Mayors, which was all the mayors who were affected. There were about 9 of them. So I had to do a lot of work in relation to our policy, what we did in terms of funding, what we did in terms of press releases and all that sort of stuff. So I was intimately involved. My property on the river wasn't in the dam footprint, so I was able to do that the job without any concerns about conflict of interest. I was just outside the footprint. And certainly I watched the debate, and I tried to enter the debate as much as we could. It was a shock to the community, and the shock has lasted a long time. Pretty well all bad, except I've got to acknowledge that quite a lot of people made an awful lot of money out of land sales. So there was a silver lining for a lucky section of the community. Everyone else who was left, it was pretty bad. Nonetheless, it's over. There's been some trauma in trying to get back to normality, but we're here now and it's good. The more I think about it, the more stories I can come up with in relation to the dam and the protests and the reaction to the community, I certainly was in the kayak and all those kayak events. In fact, you can pick my kayak because I had my dog on the front of the kayak. So I kept to the background because I was working for council, but I was there in a kayak with a dog on the front. But one thing that really stood out and which still haunts me is the ability of a lot of people in this area to rise to the occasion. A number of people with science backgrounds were invaluable. A number of people with political links, a number of business people who were in all sorts of water industry applications. What was in these hills was just amazing. And those people all came out and all fought. And there wasn't a month go by when there was someone new came out with some new information, a new angle to the argument. And it just shows you that the depth in this community And that's not just people who are in business. A lot of, I remember a couple of ladies coming forward and they read everything and studied everything, and I thought, wow, these people could have been great career ladies, but as it was, they were farmers' wives, farmers themselves, of course. But geez, there was some intelligence out there, and there was some real raw ability in the hills, and it's something that I'll never forget.
Traveston Crossing Dam is a very emotional topic for a lot of people. It's interesting, there's a lot of new people in town who may have heard of it through media and have, varying knowledge of what happened. We were directly involved in a number of ways. Our farm was in what they called the buffer zone, which was the upper reaches. So with a full dam, one of the tributaries would have cut our place in half. So it separated the community into people who received letters from the government and people who didn't. And we were one of the ones that did. There was an offer to put an easement to our place, and as I say, our place would be cut. At the time, you go through a lot of emotional decision making and so forth. I heard about the dam when I was actually coming from a community group meeting, funny story, and it was a radio announcement where they were interviewing the mayor at the time, and this great announcement of this dam that was going to be fantastic for the region. And we just nearly fell off our chairs in the car, got home, and my husband had received a phone call from a fella that he knew through industry who was now living as a retiree in the valley, who's going, "Have you heard the announcement? We need to do something about this." That was Kevin Ingersoll. So he and Rick Elliott were key drivers in the fight. So I came at it from as a personal experience owning a property, as a community resident, wondering about the future for our kids and what it would mean for the area, because it did break the connections in a lot of ways. And then I obviously offered myself to be part of the committee, did some media and that sort of thing for them. So it was an eye-opener, definitely. I'm easygoing, trust people, all the rest of it, and also because I'm a country girl, have an understanding of, you just assume things go along like this, and then you don't have a lot of money in community organisations or in community generally, and you had the government onslaught, people coming and staying for weeks at a time in motels and having meetings, and it was that contrast between people who lived in the city who were coming to do what they wanted to do and people here who didn't have a lot of money, farmers who had never thought about moving, who were then being told, and at the time it was voluntary, but you go to a farmer who's 80, whose children aren't going to take over the property, what decision do you make? You haven't even thought that far. So it was very traumatising in a lot of ways. I made the decision early on, because I was involved in this particular group, that we would work with the government for the best way forward. Know your enemy, I guess, to a certain extent. And they were good people. They didn't know what they'd been thrown into either. So it was challenging all round. QWI, the actual dam authority, tried to get me taken off the Gympie Times, reporting on it. So I was in that position where I was a resident and I was doing stories on it, and they felt that was a conflict of interest. Fortunately, my editor said, well, why wouldn't you use someone on the ground that's in the midst of that? And I like to think that I was presenting both sides of the argument. I wasn't just pushing the dam's fight. So yes, it was challenging, and the children were obviously immersed in it as well. They both say it gave them an understanding of community, grassroots community response, and that you don't necessarily have to go with what is slated. So I think for me, and I played a small part in the whole onslaught of the dam. Not to say it didn't affect everyone, in varying degrees and very deeply. It was, we have the Glenda Pickersgills and, as I said, Rick and Kevin, who brought a business mind and business planning to how we would go out. And from very early on, with Glenda's assistance, as she's an ag scientist or that background, it was all about the facts. The site was one of a number of dam sites in Queensland. It was never highly rated as a successful dam site. And then, of course, you had the talk about the endangered species and so forth. So it was many years, and I think we all still have some residual effect from that.
I can remember it very vividly. I walked into my lounge room. The news was on. This was probably around 6 o'clock. And here was a shot showing Premier Beattie doing his helicopter fly over the valley announcing a proposed dam, and it was virtually over my property. And that was the first I'd heard about it. And a complete shock. I guess the ripples of uncertainty went through the community pretty quick. I contacted my next door neighbours and Rick and Carol Elliott, and within a couple of days we were trying to get more information, trying to understand what was going on, because I had been involved in some of the water resource planning community consultation, and at no point in that revision of the Mary Basin Water Resource Plan was it ever mentioned that they were proposing to put a dam. There was a strategic reserve was being mentioned, but nothing that indicated that was to justify the dam. And that was the draft. Between the draft and the final version was when they introduced the Traveston Crossing Dam. So it was a shock. It's not uncommon for dam builders all over the world to do a similar tactic of shock the community and take on the attitude that it's a done deal. But it wasn't. I think they underestimated the depth of knowledge and creativity and connections that, in fact, that was 2006. I had actually I'd been working away from 2001 to 2006. I'd taken on some more work over in Western Australia, and because I'd purchased another small block of land next door to me, and I needed to go back and work again. So I was doing fly in, fly out up into Mount Keith, a nickel mine above Kalgoorlie, and I was the environmental coordinator there in the end for a couple of years. So I had almost like 3 lives. I had to fly in, fly out from there to Perth, and then every 6 weeks I'd come home and do all my cattle work. My father stood in and caretaked for me, but I still had to come and run the business in some way. So it was, I'd only just finished there in 2006, and I arrived back and full time back on the farm, and then this sort of hit me from the side. So of course I felt pretty I'd say for a couple of weeks I just had knots in my stomach. I just couldn't imagine that they could actually be planning to build a dam that would just completely annihilate everything that I had grown up with. I could not accept that could ever be a possibility. And I guess that's the attitude that I then threw my energy into, finding out everything that I could, the facts and the data of what was behind the proposal and where the flaws were. And when you started to talk with, we had a depth of knowledge in our community of engineers, scientists, and we started to pull apart various assumptions in the proposal, there were a lot of flaws. But it wasn't until we had a committee going within a month. People like Steve Burgess, Kevin Ingersoll. There's just a wide number of people that were able to show quite clearly that this was very, very wrong. And it was, it seemed that it was motivated to capture votes for Brisbane, or in creating a water shortage problem, which, when you looked at the amount of, all the assumptions of it, it comes back to how much people use per day in their households, and where can they be more efficient. The solution of building a dam would not have solved the problem that they looked like they were facing. They were going to run out of water. And I think it's got to be the solutions like catching water where it falls, in tanks, in stormwater basins, recycling water, even desalination if it needs to, have far, far less environmental and social consequences than building more dams. Well, very much so. And yet in the environmental impact statement, they were claiming that there wouldn't be any impacts downstream, even though they were proposing to not only take the surface water, but to build a wall that would intercept the groundwater as well. And that was clearly shown in some of the diagrams that but they were still trying to say, no, won't affect the downstream river, the flooding, the fisheries down at Harvey Bay. And that was why there was a very strong group of people downstream that came in and formed their own group and came in to combine in the campaign, was that their voices weren't being heard. When we first got the committee going, I was involved in particularly coordinating the research side of it, so collecting the facts and the data. Because we only had a couple of opportunities in which we could have a say back on the proposal. So one of the key ones was when the government put out an environmental impact statement or study, which it stood up this high in volumes of paperwork, weighed 15 kilos. It was pretty impressive. And when we went through that, we were able to pick just loads and loads of inaccuracies, I guess you could put it. Yeah. And then, so the process is that they issue that out. You then have an opportunity to put submissions into to that, so that's public submissions. So I coordinated our submission from the group, but of course we also provided and helped people to look at in their particular situation or how it was going to impact them, and so be able to give them some support in understanding, first of all, the process. So they had to have a public submission period, and then the government had to go through all those submissions. And from that, the Coordinator General would have to make a supplementary environmental impact statement. And then eventually he would either say, yes, it could go ahead. Now this is the state, could go ahead, or it couldn't. In the end, okay, so that's one part of the assessment process. The second part, because it was a project that could affect matters of national environmental significance, it brought into play the federal law. the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Law, the EPBC law. So the federal government had an opportunity to say whether it would go ahead or not. So it needed 2 levels of government approvals to be able to go ahead. And at the start, they had none. They had no approvals. So they announced the dam, but there was no approvals. And so that was one of the key things for people to understand, that there was opportunity that it could be stopped. It could be stopped by the state government, or it could be stopped by the federal government. And in fact, really, it was the state government who were wanting to propose it was a Queensland Water Infrastructure, which was the company that was formed, was a government company. So it was really the government looking after its government's project. So it had to be, the state government, so it had to be the federal government to stop it. So that was the only stop that we could do it, unless for some reason there was a change in the state government that perhaps if it was a different government they would have not gone ahead, but maybe they would have done, we don't know. We never know. But so that assessment process was the only thing that we could work to, and the time frames were very, very important. There's lots of things that happened. In fact, it was a very exciting campaign because there were just new things happening all the time. There was opportunities to raise awareness at different points. There were state elections, so we could be able to bring it in as an issue for us for a state election, and sort of lobby. Going into marginal seats and finding, influencing and making sure people were aware that these were issues that this state government was making decisions about. There were opportunities to get more support from within our community, our own community, communities linked up and down the river. And we had this lovely supportive man of Steve Posset, who was a kayaker, he just did so much kayaking. He kayaked right down from Brisbane up the Stanley River, the Brisbane River, up through Wivenhoe Dam, across, pulled his kayak on wheels up over the range and then down into the Mary, and then paddled the Mary, and was able to galvanise and raise that awareness right through the whole river system. And then he paddled back to Brisbane. And, that sort of story. And he was instrumental in paddling then from Brisbane to Sydney to raise awareness on the federal level. He met with, he took support letters and was able to, all these different, I guess, events, you might say. We got involved with the Get Up and got support from them. We had a Get Up torch that we did events. And it was an opportunity to share knowledge, build community spirit, and connect with not just our own community, but, Brisbane community, Hervey Bay, Maryborough. And it was fun. It was a fun way to get that message out.